The high desert of the Arizona Territory doesn't keep secrets. It bakes them into the dust. For Muriel Gillespie, a widow living on the edge of nowhere, the silence of her empty barn was louder than any gunshot. That silence was broken by a sound the desert should not hold, the cry of a child trapped in the stone jaws of a dark cave. She was a frontier woman taught to fear the Apache, but she was also a woman who had lost everything. When she pulled that crying toddler from the darkness, she didn't know she was setting a fire, one that would either consume her or save her. The sun over Flatiron Gulch was not a source of life. It was a hammer. It beat the land into a cracked reddish-grey submission, and it had been doing so for 93 days. Muriel Gillespie felt the heat through the soles of her worn-out boots. She stood on the warped planks of her porch, one hand gripping a wooden post, the other shading her eyes as she stared at the barn. It was empty. Not just running low, empty. It was hollow. The corn crib, usually overflowing by this time of year, thanks to her late husband Thomas, held only a scattering of shriveled kernels and dust. The hayloft was a skeleton of splintered beams. Her last 2 chickens had been taken by a coyote 2 nights prior. Her only remaining livestock was a sway-backed mule named Barnaby, and a cow so thin you could count its ribs from the porch. Muriel was a woman carved from the same stubborn rock as the canyons around her. She was tall, with hands made rough by lye soap rope and the grip of a rifle stock. Her hair, the color of dried wheat, was pulled back so tightly it emphasized the gauntness of her face. She and Thomas had built this homestead with their own hands, sinking a well that was now threatening to run dry tilling land that now refused to yield. Thomas had been gone for 2 years, taken by a rattlesnake bite that turned black and septic before she could get him the 20 miles to town. Now there was just her, the heat and the silence, and the fear. The fear was a constant low hum beneath the screech of the cicadas. It wasn't just the drought, it was the movement. That's what the men in Flatiron Gulch called it. A dust cloud on the horizon interrupted her grim assessment. One rider. She didn't relax. She stepped back inside the cabin, her hand finding the cold comfort of the Winchester .73 Thomas had prized. She stood just inside the doorway in the shadow and waited. The rider slowed, approaching the property line. It was Hiram Wade. Muriel disliked Wade. He was a small man who owned the larger part of the general store, a position he used to leverage favors and intimidation. He considered her homestead, strategically placed by a usually reliable spring, to be a waste on a lone woman. He stopped his horse 10 yards from the porch, not bothering to dismount. "Afternoon, Mrs. Gillespie." "Mr. Wade." Her voice was flat dry as the air. Wade spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Stock looks thin. It's a dry season." "It's more than that," Wade said, leaning forward on his saddle horn. His eyes, small and dark, scanned her property. "Word from the Gulch is the Mescalero are off the reservation lands, a band led by Gojin. You know that name." Muriel's grip tightened on the rifle she kept hidden by the doorframe. Everyone knew that name. Gojin was a spectre, a name used to scare children and justify whiskey sales. He was said to be unbreakable, a leader who had never bent a knee to the U.S. Army. "I hear talk," Muriel said, non-committally. "It's more than talk. The Prentice boy found 2 of his cattle slaughtered up near the North Ridge, skinned and quartered Apache style. They're close. And they're hungry." Wade's eyes drifted to her empty barn, and a predatory little smile touched his lips. "A lone woman out here. It's a danger. Not just to you, but to the town. A weak spot. I've held this land for 2 years alone, Mr. Wade. I'm not a weak spot. That's pride talk, Muriel. He sneered, dropping the misses. Pride won't stop a painted warrior. You should sell. Move into town. I'm still offering a fair price for the land and the spring rights. The spring's near dry, she lied. It was low, but it was the only water for 5 miles. That's what he wanted. It'll come back. My offer won't. He tipped his hat, a gesture that was more insult than courtesy. You think on it. When Gojin and his band come through, that rifle won't be enough. They'll see that empty barn and figure the woman inside is just as weak. He turned his horse and kicked it into a trot, leaving her in a cloud of his dust and malice. She watched him go, her anger, a hot coal in her stomach. He was a vulture, just like the desert. She turned to go back inside to measure out her flour for a joyless supper when she froze. It came from the hills, the steep rocky mesas to the north, the ones the settlers avoided. It wasn't a coyote. It wasn't a hawk. It was a cry, faint, thin, and unmistakably human. It sounded again, a high-pitched, desperate wail that was cut short, as if smothered. Wade had just warned her of warriors. Her first thought was a trap, a lure. But the sound, it was too small. It was the sound of a child. Logic fair and the hard-learned lessons of the frontier all screamed at Muriel to bar her door and wait for morning. A child crying in the rocks could be a trap. It could be a settler child lost from a passing wagon, but no wagons used the northern pass. It was too rough. That left only one terrible possibility. The sound came again, weaker this time. A desperate, terrified sobbing. Muriel's heart, a thing she'd thought had dried up and hardened with the land, gave a painful lurch. She and Thomas had never been blessed with children. The emptiness of her cabin was a mirror of the emptiness of her barn. She grabbed the Winchester, checked the load, and slung a canteen of her precious water over her shoulder. She told herself she was just going to look. She was a fool, Thomas would have said. But Thomas wasn't here. She moved not toward the road, but northwest into the maze of sandstone and scrub. The sun was beginning to dip, painting the clouds in violent strokes of orange and purple. The Red Rock Country, they called it. The heat of the day radiated back from the stones, turning the shallow canyons into an oven. "Hello?" She called out, her voice sounding small. The crying stopped, replaced by a panicked scrambling, like a small animal digging. "I have water," she said, moving slower. "It's all right. I have water." She followed the sound for nearly half a mile, climbing over tumbled boulders until she reached a shadowed cleft in the rock face. It was a narrow fissure, barely 2 feet wide, leading back into the darkness. The sobbing was coming from inside. "Come out," she said softly, laying her rifle on a flat rock. She showed her empty hands. "I won't hurt you." Only a terrified whimper answered. This was it. The moment of decision. A snake could be in there, a mountain lion, or worse, a warrior waiting, using the child as bait. Muriel took a breath, smelling the ozone of the hot rock and the faint, dusty scent of sage. She pulled a match from her apron pocket, struck it on the stone, and ducked into the fissure. The cave was shallow, barely 10 feet deep. The match flame flickered, casting huge, dancing shadows. In the back, huddled behind a small boulder, was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 3 years old. He was wearing a simple buckskin breechclout and nothing else. His black hair was matted with dirt, his face streaked with tears and red dust. His skin was feverish and dry, and he was without a shadow of a doubt Apache. He stared at her, his black eyes wide, with a terror so profound it went beyond sound. "Oh, Lord," Muriel whispered. The match burned her fingers and she dropped it, plunging them into darkness. She heard him gasp and scramble further back. "It's all right," she said, her voice shaking. She fumbled for another match. I'm not going to hurt you." She struck the second match. He had wedged himself into the corner, his small body trembling. Her eyes adjusted. She saw him. And then she saw it. Next to the depression where he had been sitting was a small, finely woven pouch of dried berries and a tiny water skin, the kind a child could carry. The water skin was flat, empty. This was the twist that chilled her more than the cave. He wasn't lost. He was hidden. Someone had put him here, someone who intended to come back, someone who had left him with provisions that had run out. She uncorked her canteen. The sound of the sloshing water made the boy jerk his eyes, fixing on it. He made a low, guttural sound. Thirst. She knelt, shuffling forward on her knees, holding the canteen out. "Water," she said. "Sea water." He stared at her, then at the canteen. His desperation warred with his fear. Finally his thirst won. He lunged forward, not like a child, but like a cornered animal, grabbing the canteen with both hands and trying to pull it away from her. He drank greedily, spilling water down his chin. When she tried to steady the canteen, he hissed and bit her hand. Muriel cried out, pulling back. He had teeth like a small wolf. He scrambled back into his corner, clutching the canteen, watching her. "All right, child," Muriel said, sucking on her bleeding knuckle. "You keep it." She sat back on her heels. The match went out. They were in the dark again. She could hear him drinking, then a small, gasping cough. She knew she had to make a choice. She could leave him. She could walk away, go back to her cabin, bar the door, and pretend she'd never heard a thing. By morning, he'd be dead from the heat, or a coyote would find him, or his people would return. And if they found her here, they would assume the worst. Or... She struck a third match. The boy had finished the water. He was huddled, his eyes drooping. He was exhausted, starved, and terrified. "I can't leave you," she whispered. "God help me, I can't." She moved forward slowly. He tried to press himself into the rock. "No." He whispered a single, sharp word she understood. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry, but you can't stay here." She lunged, grabbing him before he could react. He shrieked a piercing, bird-like cry and began to fight. He kicked, punched, and bit his small fists, beating a frantic rhythm on her chest. Muriel held him tight, wrapping her arms around his small, flailing body, and backed out of the cave. The setting sun hit them as she emerged. The boy screamed again, blinded by the light, and buried his face in her shoulder, his body shuddering with sobs. Muriel, breathing heavily, stood with the stolen, biting Apache Toddler in her arms, her hand bleeding, and the Winchester lying uselessly on the rock beside her. She picked up the rifle. "Hush, child," she murmured, her voice rough. "Hush now, we're going home." She started the half-mile walk, back her mind, a riot of conflicting terrors. She had just saved a child, and she had almost certainly just signed her own death warrant. Getting the boy back to the cabin was a battle. He was light, but he fought with the desperate, wiry strength of a bobcat. By the time she got the door barred, she was bleeding from the bite on her hand, a deep scratch on her neck, and a kick to the shin that she was sure would leave a purple-black bruise. She set him down on the rough-hewn floor. He immediately scrambled under the table, pressing himself against the wall, his eyes tracking her every move. "Well," Muriel panted, leaning against the door. "This is a fine mess, Thomas. A fine mess." The cabin was one room with a small loft where Thomas had kept his tack and where Muriel now stored her preserves. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a rope-strung bed the other. It was clean, sparse, and lonely. The boy watched her. "You're filthy," she said more to herself than to him. She moved to the wash basin, pouring more of her precious well water into it. The boy flinched. She ignored him, soaking a rag. She approached the table slowly. "Come on out. Let's get you clean," he hissed. "I'm not asking." She grabbed his ankle and dragged him out, squirming and spitting. She held him firmly and began to wash his face. The dirt came off in muddy streaks, revealing fine, sharp features, and a bruise high on his cheekbone. He fought her the whole time, but his struggles were weaker now. The water and the walk had taken the last of his energy. When she was done, she saw it, a thin leather cord around his neck. Tucked into it was a small, beautifully carved piece of turquoise, shaped like a hawk's feather. She touched it. "What's this, then?" The boy's hand flew up and covered the amulet, his eyes flashing with a sudden, protective anger. All right, it's yours." She was hungry. He must be too. She had little to offer. She crumbled up a piece of dry cornbread into a bowl and softened it with a splash of milk from her thin cow. She pushed the bowl under the table toward him. He stared at it, suspicion radiating from him. But the smell of the milk and corn was too much. He snatched the bowl, turned his back to her, and began to scoop the mush into his mouth with his hands. Muriel sat on her stool, resting the Winchester across her lap. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a bone-deep weariness and a new, colder fear. What had she done? Hiram Wade had been right. The Apache were close, this boy's family, and they would be looking for him. When they found him here, with her, a white woman, they would not ask questions. They would not see a rescue. They would see a kidnapping. She sat listening to the boy eat her knuckles, white on the rifle. The sun went down. The cabin filled with shadows. The boy, his belly full, crawled back under the table, and with a final shuddering sigh fell asleep. Muriel did not sleep. She sat in her rocker, the rifle in her lap, watching the square of the window. Every gust of wind was a footstep. Every hoot of an owl was a signal. She was waiting for the fire, for the war cries. They didn't come. Dawn broke grey and merciless. The boy was still asleep. Muriel felt heavy, her thoughts thick as mud. She had to take him to town, to Flatiron Gulch. Deputy Shaw would know what to do. He could send word to the army to the reservation. She had just decided on this course when she heard the horses. Not the quiet, moccasined footsteps she had feared, the heavy, shod horse plod of a settler. She looked through the window. It was Hiram Wade, and he wasn't alone. He had two other men with him, Peter Llewellyn and Milo Byrne, who ran the smithy. Muriel's stomach turned to ice. She went to the door, the Winchester in her hands, and stood on the porch. Wade reined in his eyes, immediately going to the rifle. "Getting jumpy, Mrs. Gillespie." "What do you want, Mr. Wade?" "Town's in an uproar. My wife saw you from her window yesterday evening. Saw you coming out of the Red Rocks, carrying something. Thought it was a bundle. But then we heard crying, coming from your cabin." Muriel's face was a stone mask. "I found a lost child." "A lost child?" Wade's voice was slick with mock disbelief. He dismounted, walking slowly toward her. "What kind of lost child, I wonder? Not a settler child. We're all accounted for." He stopped at the foot of the porch steps, close enough that she could smell the sour whiskey on his breath. "Let's see the child, Muriel." "He's asleep, and he's scared. You'll stay right there." "She's hiding it," Wade called back to the other men. "Just like I said, she's consorting with them." "Consorting?" Llewellyn, a nervous, reed-thin man, shifted in his saddle. "Now, Hiram, that's a—" "Shut up, Peter. She's brought a patch brat into her home. After I warned her, she's put the entire Gulch at risk." As if summoned by the shouting, the boy appeared in the doorway behind Muriel. He had rubbed the sleep from his eyes. his black hair standing on end. He saw the 3 men on horseback, and he did the one thing that sealed Muriel's fate. He ran to her and clung to her leg, hiding his face in the folds of her skirt. A collective gasp went up from the 2 men on horseback. Wade's face transformed, settling into a mask of righteous, triumphant fury. "So," Wade breathed, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr. "There it is. And it. You've brought a snake into your house, Muriel, and now you've brought them to our town." "He was alone," Muriel said, her voice shaking but hard. "He was starving, in a cave." "Lies," Wade spat. "You stole him. A trade, was it? Trading supplies for. That you're an Indian lover, and you're bringing Gojin's wrath down on all of us. Get off my property, Hiram. We're taking the brat," Wade said, stepping up onto the first plank. "We'll turn it over to the army. They'll know what to do." "You will not." "Don't be a fool, woman," Milo Byrne shouted, his smith's arms bulging as he gripped his reins. "He's right. They'll follow the child here. They'll burn us all out." Wade lunged, not for the boy, but to grab the rifle. Muriel was faster. She sidestepped, raising the Winchester to her hip and cocking the hammer. The click-click was the loudest sound in the territory. Wade froze his hand halfway to the gun. "I said," Muriel enunciated, her voice deadly quiet, "get off my property." The boy was crying at her feet, clinging to her leg. The 3 men stared at the black bore of the rifle. Hiram Wade slowly, very slowly lowered his hand. His face was pale with rage. "You've made your choice, Mrs. Gillespie," he hissed. "You've chosen them over your own kind. When they come, don't you look to Flatiron Gulch for help. Don't you dare." He backed away, mounted his horse, and the 3 of them wheeled around, galloping back toward the town. Muriel stood there, trembling, the heavy rifle in her arms, until their dust was just a memory. She looked down at the child who was staring up at her, his tears leaving new, clean tracks in the dirt on his face. She was completely, utterly alone, trapped between the malice of the settlers and the impending arrival of the Apache. The departure of Hiram Wade did not bring peace. It brought a new kind of silence, heavy and suffocating. Muriel was now an outlaw in her own community. The town of Flatiron Gulch, her only potential refuge, had declared her an enemy. She barred the door, dragged a heavy chest in front of it, and secured the window shutters, leaving only a small crack to see and shoot through. The cabin was plunged into a hot, dusty gloom. The boy, sensing the shift from fear to a siege mentality, grew quiet. He sat by the cold hearth watching her. He no longer tried to bite, but he refused to let her near him. Muriel tried to think. What was her plan? She couldn't stay here. Wade would be back, and next time he'd bring more men. Deputy Shaw was a reasonable man, but he was easily swayed by a mob, and Wade was an expert at creating them. She couldn't run. Not with the mule and the thin cow. They wouldn't get 5 miles. That left only the Apache. Her stomach clenched. She had to return the boy. It was her only chance. But how walk out into the desert, holding a child, and hope the first warriors she met would listen before they shot? "What's your name, child?" she murmured, mostly to the shadows. The boy just stared. He picked up the turquoise amulet, rubbing it between his thumb and forefinger. "Hawk," Muriel decided, looking at the feather. "I'll call you Hawk in my head. It's better than boy." 2 days passed. They lived in the stifling heat of the sealed cabin. The air grew sour. Muriel's nerves were stretched to the breaking point. She rationed their water and the last of the cornbread. Every time the mule brayed, she jumped, her hand flying to the rifle. The boy Hawk seemed to be fading. He was quiet, but it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the quiet of resignation. He missed his family. He was grieving. Muriel saw it, and it reminded her so much of the first few months after Thomas died that it physically hurt. On the third morning, she couldn't stand the darkness anymore. She had to know what was happening. She cracked open the heavy shutter on the north-facing window, the one that looked out toward the red rocks. At first, she saw nothing, just the shimmering heat haze rising from the stones. Then she saw it. A glint. Not sunlight on rock. Sunlight on metal? She squinted, her heart hammering. On the high ridge, the one overlooking her entire property, was a man. He was on horseback, stationary, a small dark shape against the bright sky. He was too far to make out details, but she didn't need to. He wasn't a settler. He wasn't wearing a hat. He was watching. "Oh God," she whispered. The boy, hearing the terror in her voice, crawled over to the window. She spent the day tracking the watcher. He didn't move. He was a statue of pure menace, a sentinel. She was a mouse in a box, and the hawk was circling. Wade and his men hadn't returned. Now she knew why. The Apache were here. They had likely seen Wade too. The entire valley was in a silent standoff. As dusk fell, the watcher on the ridge was joined by another, and then a third. 3 dark silhouettes against a blood-red sky. Muriel felt a cold dread settle over her. This wasn't a war party. A war party would have attacked by now. This was something else. This was calculated. They were waiting. But for what? That night she slept in the rocker, the rifle across her lap, her body aching with tension. The next morning she went to the window. They were gone. The ridge was empty. Muriel's blood ran cold. This was worse. The silence before the strike. Had they gone, given up? Or were they moving in, crawling through the scrub, preparing to rush the cabin? She stared at the empty ridge, her eyes burning from the strain. The boy hawk was at her feet. He had been staring at the ridge too. He pointed a small, dusty finger. "Aina," he whispered. It was the first word he'd spoken other than no. "Aina!" He said it again, louder, his voice cracking with a desperate hope. He ran to the door, scratching at the wood. "Aina!" Muriel didn't understand the word, but she understood the tone. It was a name. It was a plea. He was pointing at the ridge where the watchers had been. He hadn't been afraid of them. He had been calling to them. Her mind reeled. The watchers. They weren't a war party. They were a search party. They were looking for the boy. And now they had vanished. She looked at the child who was now weeping by the door, calling that one word over and over. She made a decision. It was quite possibly the stupidest, most reckless decision of her life. But staying here was a death sentence. She unbarred the door. She grabbed the boy by the hand. "Hush," she said. "We're going to find your Ina." She grabbed her canteen, slung the rifle over her other shoulder, and stepped out onto the porch. She left the door of her cabin wide open. She squinted against the morning light. The world was empty. The ridge was empty. Wade was nowhere to be seen. "Which way?" she asked the child. He stopped crying, his eyes wide. He pointed not to the ridge but to the east, toward the low foothills that led to the dry riverbed. "All right," Muriel said, her mouth as dry as the dirt. "Lead the way." They hadn't taken 10 steps past the empty barn when a voice, deep and resonant, shattered the silence. "Stop." Muriel froze. The voice had come from the cottonwoods by the dry creek, a place she hadn't been watching. She turned slowly. They emerged from the trees, not 3 but 5. 5 Apache warriors mounted on strong painted ponies. They were not in tatters. They were proud, strong, and armed with rifles and lances. The man in the center was imposing. His face was painted with 2 black stripes across his cheeks. His hair was long, held back by a simple band. His eyes, black and piercing, were fixed on her. This had to be Gojin. Muriel's hand tightened on her rifle strap. The boy hawk let go of her hand. He took 1 step, 2 steps, and then he broke into a run, his legs pumping as fast as they could. "Oina!" He screamed, his voice joyous. A figure on a horse to the right of the leader broke from the line. It wasn't a warrior. It was a woman. She slid from the horse before it had even stopped landing on her feet and running. She met the boy halfway, scooping him up into her arms, burying her face in his hair, her shoulders shaking with sobs. She murmured to him in a rapid, loving torrent of words. Muriel let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. It was over. It was a rescue. She lowered her rifle, letting it hang by its strap. She even managed a small, shaky smile. Then she looked at the leader. Gojin hadn't moved. His face was not relieved. It was a mask of cold, unadulterated fury. He dismounted, handing his reins to the man beside him. He began to walk toward Muriel. He was tall, and with every step he seemed to grow larger. He stopped 10 feet from her. He spoke in broken, heavily accented English. "You take child." It wasn't a question. It was a death sentence. The world snapped into a terrifying, sharp focus. The joy of the reunion was extinguished, replaced by the hot, metallic taste of fear. The mother Nali was clutching her son, her back to Muriel, whispering to him. The other 3 warriors had fanned out their rifles, held loosely but ready. And Gojin was staring at her, his eyes promising a slow, painful end. "No," Muriel said, her voice a dry rasp. I found him." "Found?" Gojin repeated. The word sounded like a curse. He pointed to her cabin. "You steal. From cave." "He was crying," Muriel protested, her voice rising. "He was thirsty, alone. I brought him water." Gojin's expression didn't soften. To him, the facts were simple. The boy was in their sacred hiding place. Now he was here in the white woman's house. It was a theft. Where? "Others," he demanded, his eyes scanning the homestead. "The men who ride with you. What men?" "There are no others." "Lies," one of the other warriors shouted. "We see 3 men. Ride here, ride away. You, partners." Muriel's blood ran cold. They had seen Hiram Wade. They thought they were working together. They thought she was part of a kidnapping party. No, she said, shaking her head, desperate. They are enemies. They hate me. They hate him." She pointed at the boy. Gojin's face was stone. He didn't believe her. He took another step forward, and at that exact terrible moment, a new sound entered the standoff. The thunder of shod horses riding hard from the south. "See, Muriel, they're back," a voice roared. Hiram Wade. Peter Llewellyn, Milo Byrne, and 4 other men from Flatiron Gulch burst from the line of trees near the main road. They reined their horses into a skidding, dusty line, creating a second front. They were heavily armed. Well. Wade crowed, his rifle aimed not at the Apache, but at Muriel. "Caught you, didn't we, consorting with the enemy? Trading, or just giving aid?" The situation had become a nightmare. Muriel was trapped in a triangle of death. Gojin and his warriors were in front of her. Wade and the settlers were behind her. The mother Nali had pulled her son behind the horses. Gojin slowly turned his hand raised. His warriors tensed their rifles, rising to meet the new threat. "This is not your business," Gojin said to Wade. "Not my business," Wade laughed, a high-pitched, ugly sound. "You're on our land, savage. And that woman," he jabbed a finger at Muriel, "is a traitor. She harbored your spawn. Whatever deal you 2 cut, it's over." Muriel was standing alone in the 20 yards of no man's land between the 2 groups. "Mr. Wade, you have to listen." Muriel yelled, her voice cracking. "I didn't steal him, I found him." "Quiet, traitor," Wade bellowed. "Deputy Shaw is indisposed. The town appointed me to handle this, and I say we're taking the woman, and we're taking the brat. The rest of you," he gestured to Gojin, "can ride out, or be buried here." It was a bluff, a stupid, arrogant bluff. Wade's 7 men were nervous, their horses shifting. Gojin's 5 warriors were like carved stone, their ponies steady, their aim perfect. They were outnumbered, but they were not outmatched. Gojin looked from Wade back to Muriel. He saw her terror, he saw her isolation, and he saw the hatred in Wade's eyes. A flicker of something doubt confusion crossed his face. "She, not with you," Gojin stated. "She's worse," Wade spat. "She's a turncoat. Give us the woman savage. She's our problem." "No," Gojin said. Wade's jaw dropped. "What may she is ours, the problem." Gojin turned his full attention back to Muriel. The settlers at his back were for the moment irrelevant. He was the judge. "You say, you find." "Yes," Muriel whispered, her eyes wide. "In the cave, by the red rocks. He was left. He had a water skin. It was empty. He had berries." She was babbling, but the details were important. "He had this." She pointed to the small turquoise feather amulet, which was now clutched in the boy's hand as he peeked out from behind his mother. At the mention of the amulet and the berries, the mother Gnarly looked up. She said something sharp to Gojin in Apache. Gojin's head snapped toward her. He listened. Gnarly spoke again, her voice urgent, pointing first at the boy, then at the sky, then to the northeast. A new warrior, one who had been silent, spoke up. His English was cleaner learned at a trading post. "She says, 'It is true.'" The warrior translated his eyes on Muriel. "Gnarly, she hid the boy. Tilichogi." His name, Muriel breathed. Tilichogi. Little prairie dog. "We were not attacked by whites." The warrior continued his gaze, flicking to Wade's armed party with contempt. "We were attacked by Comanche. A raid. They came from the northeast." Gnarly ran. She put her son Tlichogi in the dew. "The cave. It is a sacred place." She left him with water and food. She ran to draw the Comanche away. The story tumbled out. The running battle had lasted 2 days. They had lost the Comanche, but when Gnarly and Gojin, the boy's father, had returned to the cave, Tlichogi was gone. "The tracks." Gojin said, his voice low, "led here, to this house. We thought," the translator said, "you were a Nardley, a slaver. We saw the men, Wade, come. We thought you sold our son to them." Wade scoffed. "A likely story, a load of hogwash. They're just trying to—" "Silence!" Gojin roared. The word had the force of a physical blow. Wade's horse actually shied. Gojin looked at Muriel. His face was no longer angry. It was something far more complex. It was appraisal. He was recalculating the entire world. He looked at her, then at her house. He saw the barred windows. He saw the chest by the door. He saw the empty barn. He saw a woman who had barricaded herself in not a woman preparing for a trade. "You fight them?" he asked, gesturing to Wade. "Yes," Muriel said. "Yesterday, they tried to take Tlichogi. I pointed my rifle. I told them to leave." Hiram Wade's face went purple. "She's admitting it. She defended the savage over her own people." Gojin nodded slowly. He had all the pieces. He looked at Wade. "You go. Now. This Shanita, this matter, is not yours." "I will not," Wade blustered. "I'm here to enforce the—" Gojin didn't raise his voice. He simply raised his rifle, cocked the hammer, and aimed it at Wade's chest. "Go." The other 4 Apache warriors did the same. their rifles snapping up to target 4 different settlers. Wade's posse dissolved. Peter Llewellyn and Milo Byrne immediately raised their hands. "Now hold on, Hiram," Byrne said, his voice a squeak. "I ain't dying for this. He's got the boy. Let's just go." Wade stared down the barrel of Gojin's rifle. He was shaking with a rage that made him speechless. He looked at Muriel, his eyes promising murder. "This isn't over," he whispered. He yanked his horse's head around and galloped away his posse, scrambling behind him in a cloud of humiliating dust. The clearing was silent again. Muriel was shaking so hard she thought her knees would buckle. Gojin lowered his rifle. He looked at Muriel. He studied her face, her torn apron, her bleeding knuckle from where Tlishogi had bitten her. He looked at his son, who was now safe, clinging to his mother. Nali was stroking his hair, her face a mask of profound, tear-streaked relief. Finally, Gojin turned back to Muriel. He gave her a long, silent appraisal. She had saved his son from thirst. She had cleaned him. She had fed him. And she had defended him with a rifle against her own people. He said one word. "Wait." Then he mounted his horse. Inali Tlichogi and the other warriors turned their ponies and rode not fast, but with purpose, back into the cottonwoods, and disappeared. Muriel stood alone in the dust, her cabin door open, her barn empty, her world completely upended. "Wait," she whispered to the empty air. "Wait for what?" The 2 days that followed were a new kind of hell. The silence was absolute. Wade did not return. The Apache did not return. It was as if the confrontation had never happened, a fever dream born of heat and fear. Muriel was in limbo. She swept her cabin, patched the tear in her apron, and milked her cow, her actions mechanical. She kept the Winchester close, but she no longer knew who she was watching for. Was Wade gathering a larger mob in town? Was Gojin's weight a threat? Were they deciding on a fitting punishment for the white woman who had touched their child? She felt utterly wrung out, a piece of old laundry, bleached and forgotten in the sun. She had no allies. The town had cast her out. The Apache whose son she had saved had left her with a single, ambiguous command. On the 3rd morning, she woke before dawn. There was a sound. Her eyes snapped open. She was in the rocker, the rifle in her lap. The sound was not a gunshot. It was not a war cry. It was shuffling, a scraping sound, and the soft nickering of horses. Many horses. She crept to the cracked window, her heart in her throat. Her homestead was full of people. In the pre-dawn grey, she could make out at least 20 figures. They were not warriors. They were women, older men, and half-grown children. They were Apache. They were working. They moved with a quiet, swift efficiency that was breathtaking. A line of women, Nali among them, was walking from a string of ponies parked near the cottonwoods. The ponies were laden with heavy buckskin sacks. The women were carrying these sacks one by one into her barn. Muriel fumbled with the bar, pulled the chest away, and threw open the door. She stepped onto the porch. The work did not stop. They acknowledged her with a glance, then continued. She walked, dumbfounded, toward the barn. The scraping sound was the sound of corn. Her empty, hollow corn crib was being filled. A river of blue, red, and yellow maize was pouring into it from the sacks. Other ponies were being unloaded. Sacks of dried meat, beans, smoked pumpkins. Piles of thick, beautifully cured buffalo and deer hides. Woven blankets. It was a harvest. It was a fortune. Nali saw her. She approached her face, no longer tear-stained or fearful. She was calm, her expression one of profound gravity. She held out her hand. In her palm was the turquoise hawk feather amulet. She was offering it to Muriel. Muriel, stunned, looked at the precious amulet, then at Nali. She shook her head. No, she whispered. I can't. That's his. She pointed to Tlichogi, who was watching from the safety of a pony. Nali looked at her, then smiled. It was a small, brilliant smile. She understood. It was not a trade. Nali nodded, then walked to Muriel's porch and placed the turquoise amulet on the railing next to the post Muriel always gripped. A gift left not given for her to accept in her own time. A single rider approached from the trees. It was Gojin. He was not in paint. He rode his horse to the edge of the barn and watched his people work. Muriel walked over to him. She didn't know what to say. Thank you. Felt impossibly small. Gojin looked down at her. He gestured with his chin toward the barn, now bustling with life and riches. You feed my son, he said. His English was still broken, but his meaning was clear. We feed you. He then gestured to the corral which had held only her mule Barnaby. You fight for my son. You lose your people. Muriel looked. Tethered to the corral fence were 4 new animals. Not ponies, but strong, broad-chested horses, the kind that could pull a plow or a wagon, the kind that could survive a winter. For your courage, Gojin said. He used an Apache word she didn't know. Then he translated it himself. Nujud. It is good. Muriel Gillespie, the woman who had not cried when her husband died, who had not cried when the drought took her farm, who had not cried when Hiram Wade threatened her life, felt tears streaming down her face. She nodded, unable to speak. The work was done by sunrise. The barn, which had been a hollow symbol of her failure and desolation, was now overflowing. Her corn crib was full. Her hayloft was stacked with dried meat and furs. Her corral held horses that would make Hiram Wade sick with envy. Gojin raised a hand. As one, the tribe gathered their empty packs and mounted their ponies. They moved back toward the cottonwoods. Nali was the last to leave. She held Tlichogi in front of her on the saddle. The boy, his face clean, his belly full, looked at Muriel. He did not smile, but he raised one small hand and wiggled his fingers. Muriel raised her own, her hand still scarred from his bite. Then they were gone. They dissolved into the high desert as if they were made of the same dust and light that had hidden them. Muriel stood in the dawn, the only sounds the stamp of her new horses and the creak of her barn door sagging under the weight of her newfound survival. On her porch railing, the turquoise feather caught the first ray of morning sun, glowing with a deep, impossible blue. For a long time, Muriel did not move. The sheer physical reality of the event was too much to absorb. The smell of the maize was thick and dusty in the air. The hides were piled so high they blocked the light from the small barn window. She walked into the barn. She ran her hands through the corn. It was real. She touched the flank of one of the new horses. It was warm and solid. This was not a gift. It was a payment. It was a trade, but not the one Hiram Wade had imagined. It was a life for a life, or more accurately, a life for a livelihood. Gojin, in his way, had understood her situation completely. He had seen her empty barn and her hostile neighbors. He had understood that in saving his son, she had signed her own warrant with the white world. She could no longer go to Flatiron Gulch. She could not buy flour from Wade's store or have Milo Byrne shoe her mule. So he had replaced her world. He hadn't just given her food. He had given her independence. He had given her wealth. The furs and hides alone were worth more than Wade had offered for her entire property. The horses were a new beginning. The corn and meat meant she would survive the coming winter, and the one after that. She had been saved not by the town, not by the army, but by the very people she had been taught to fear. Her reverie was broken by the sound of a single, slow clomping horse. She stepped out of the barn, her hand instinctively going to the rifle she had left on the porch. It was Hiram Wade. He was alone. He rode his horse up to her property line, the same place he had been just days before. He stared. His eyes went from the horses to the barn where a sack of beans had been left near the door. His jaw was slack. He had clearly expected to find her dead or dragged away. He had come to survey his new property. Instead, he found a fortress of provisions. "What is this?" he stammered. Muriel walked to her porch, picked up the Winchester, and cradled it in her arm. "It's a payment, Mr. Wade." "Payment?" His voice was a squeak of disbelief. They paid you for what? For harboring." "They paid me for decency, Mr. Wade," Muriel said. Her voice was no longer flat or afraid. It was cold. "It's a concept you wouldn't recognize." Wade's face contorted a mask of baffled rage and, for the first time, fear. This woman was no longer a weak, isolated widow. She was something else. She was protected. This is an outrage," he sputtered. You're a squaw man. You're consorting. I'll bring the army. I'll have you burned out." "You do that, Hiram," Muriel said, and she even smiled. "You go to the fort and tell the soldiers that the widow Gillespie has too much corn. You tell them Gojin himself stocked her barn. You tell them and see what they do." She let the implication hang in the air. The army would be very interested to know that Gojin was in the area, and more than that, was engaging in peaceful, massive trade. They would be interested in the woman he had apparently taken under his protection. They would ask questions that might make life very uncomfortable for a man like Hiram Wade, who had tried to incite a mob and lynch her. Wade understood. He was trapped. He was a bully who had lost his leverage. He stared at the barn, then at her. He saw the turquoise amulet on the railing, glowing in the sun. It was a symbol, a flag. It declared this homestead to be outside his jurisdiction. Without another word, he turned his horse. He did not gallop. He rode away, a defeated man, his back slumped. Muriel watched him go, and for the first time since Thomas died, she felt completely, unshakably safe. She turned, walked onto her porch, and picked up the turquoise feather. The stone was smooth and cool in her calloused, scarred hand. She looped the leather cord and tied it around her neck, tucking the amulet under her shirt, where it rested against her heart. The story of Gillespie's harvest, as it came to be known, spread through Flatiron Gulch with the speed of a brush fire. Hiram Wade's version, full of treachery and dark bargains, was quickly overtaken by the more fantastical and truer version that Peter Llewellyn and Milo Byrne told their voices full of awe and terror. They spoke of the standoff, of Gojin's silent fury, and of Muriel's impossible courage. Wade's power in the town withered. Men who had once feared his economic hold now looked at him with something bordering on contempt. He was the man who had tried to lead a mob against a woman who was apparently under the direct protection of the most powerful Apache leader in the territory. He had not only been cowardly, he had been wrong. Muriel's life changed. She did not go to town. She didn't need to. That winter was one of the harshest on record. The drought broke in a series of blizzards that buried the territory in 6 feet of snow. In Flatiron Gulch, people starved. Wade's store, cut off from supply lines, was empty by January. But on the homestead by the Red Rocks, Muriel Gillespie thrived. She had food. She had warmth, thanks to the thick hides. Her animals were strong. She wasn't just surviving. She was prosperous. In February, Milo Byrne walked the 20 miles to her homestead, his face gaunt. He didn't come with a rifle. He came with his hat in his hand, begging to trade his smith work for a sack of corn. Muriel looked at him, the man who had ridden with Wade. She saw the desperation in his eyes. She nodded. "A sack of corn," she said, "for 2 sets of new shoes for my horses, and a new hinge for my barn door." It was the beginning. She became the new center of the valley's economy. People came to her, not to Wade. They traded work tools and news for the food she had in abundance. She never haggled, but she always demanded a fair trade. She was no longer the widow Gillespie. She was Mrs. Gillespie, the woman who had faced down 2 enemies at once and won. She never saw Gojin or Tlichogi again. The Apache wars continued, then faded. The reservations were enforced. The railroad came through missing Flatiron Gulch by 10 miles and turning it into a ghost town. But Muriel stayed. She lived on that homestead for another 40 years. She died an old woman, respected and a little feared in the cabin she and Thomas had built. When the new settlers, the ones who arrived by train, came to auction off her property, they found the barn was still the most solid structure in the county. And when they went through her things, they found a small, locked chest. Inside was a single perfect turquoise hawk feather, the leather cord stiff and dark with age. They thought it was a pretty, worthless Indian trinket. They didn't know it was the receipt for the most expensive and most valuable transaction that had ever taken place in the Arizona Territory. It was the proof of a time when a simple act of human kindness bridged a divide wider than any canyon, and when a debt was paid, not in gold or in blood, but in corn and horses and honor. And that's the story of Muriel Gillespie and the harvest she earned. It's a reminder that in the unforgiving Wild West, courage wasn't just about how fast you could draw a gun. It was about who you were when you were trapped between a rock and a hard place, between your own people and what you knew was right. It was a time when a simple act of decency could change your life, and when honor was paid in full. What do you think? Would you have had the courage to do what Muriel did? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story of the Old West compelling, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share it with someone who loves a good frontier tale, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more true stories and hidden histories from the American frontier. We have a new story coming next week you won't want to miss. Thanks for listening.